You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast, coming to you from Montecito, California. And before we begin today, I want to remind you that there is a website associated with this podcast. It's wealthformula.com. Go check that out. Lots of potential resources you may find interesting. It's also where you can sign up for our investor club for accredited investors. You can also potentially sign up for our course in our Wealth Formula Network community. That actually has a microsite itself if you want to check that out at wealthformularoadmap.com. Anyway, as for today, I was thinking about this. I was in high school when the Berlin Wall came down. I think I was like in 10th grade or something. And the ensuing decade was really like none other that I have experienced in my life. It was the 1990s, and during that time, there was no more Cold War. Decades of fear of nuclear annihilation vanished into thin air, and 9/11 had not yet happened, so we didn't really know or feel this new world of terrorism that sort of followed in the following decade. It could be that I was young and stupid, which I'm sure I was, but life seemed good, right? It seemed fairly safe, and everybody kind of got along. The news of the day was about like Monica Lewinsky's stained dress, and political conflict really seemed ludicrous, but it really was pretty benign. Back then I used to think, because of the way this progressed in my life, these sort of things just seemed to be getting better then, that the world just got better with time. It would just evolve and the conflicts start to go away. But in the last 20, 30 years, I've realized that it's actually more of a pendulum. There's no doubt that we live in turbulent times. The country's horribly divided to the point where rational individuals have brought up the idea of a national divorce, which I'm definitely not in favor of. And Ronald Reagan is rolling in his grave hearing about this. So, nevertheless, as crazy as these times may seem, we should keep in perspective that we have seen worse. In 1861, for example, we actually did have a civil war. And as for cultural wars, all you got to do is go back to 1968, see what was going on then, and compare it with now. And you say, now might be pretty tame. Of course, I don't need to tell you that the United States has had numerous economic booms and busts throughout our history. Bottom line is that history does not necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And my guest on today's Wealth Formula Podcast episode is an esteemed historian that has recognized specific historical patterns and suggests that they are highly predictable. In fact, he says that we are in the final stage of an 80-year cycle right now. So find out what that's all about and more when we come back from these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Neil Howe. Neil is an acclaimed historian, economist, and demographer, and the best-selling author of The Fourth Turning. He is considered by some the nation's leading thinker on today's generations, who they are, what motivates them, and how they will shape America's future. He's also managing director of demography at Hedgeye Risk Management, an independent financial risk firm, as well as president of Life Course Associates, which serves hundreds of corporate, nonprofit, and government clients. Neil, welcome to Wealth Formula Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Doc.
So, first of all, just as an aside, I thought it was interesting. The producer of the show mentioned that you coined the term millennial. Is that right?
Yes, that was a book I wrote with Bill Strauss back in 1991. And it was a history of America told as a sequence of generational biographies. And we were sort of somewhat surprised no one had done that before. We did it. We started with the Puritan Great Migration to New England in the 1630s. We went all the way up to the present, and lo and behold, there was the 14th generation had not yet been named. They were just kids being born. And we expected that their first cohort, born around 1982, would be the high school class of 2000. So we named them Millennial.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
So, Yeah, and that was, but it took a while for the name to catch on. During most of the 1990s, they were called Gen Y or something like that.
Yeah.
Sort of the letter after X. But not too long after 2009/11, people began to actually see who these kids were as they started becoming adults. And they realized it was a very different generation, and millennials did catch on.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's pivot back to I guess the what's relevant to our show. You are a historian that's interested in looking at human cycles that also drive economic cycles, and specifically as it goes with your book, The Fourth Turning. Why don't we start with that? What are the four turnings?
Well, this is we started out by talking about generations, and my first interest was simply, and Bill's interest too. We wrote together for a good while, was in looking at generations themselves, differences in generations, awareness of generations, and we found many people my age. We came of age with the late '60s and '70s. Everyone was talking about generations back then. But then by the late '80s, no one was talking about it. You know what I mean? There's sort of waves when we talk about generations and we're aware of differences, and then we don't. Well, we found that people had been talking about these differences all the way back, all of American history. And not only that, but these generations tended to follow each other in a certain kind of pattern, right? Every time we have a very idealistic, crusading generation like boomers were, you get kind of a pragmatic, cynical Xer generation. That was nothing new. We saw the same thing after the transcendental generation of Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman. We got the Gilded generation of Mark Twain and Ulysses Grant. And the more we looked at these patterns, Buck, the more we realized that these patterns are actually closely linked to a pattern that historians have often noticed about American history, about political and economic rhythms, long-term rhythms, and that is that about once every long human lifetime, we have this period of huge public mobilization and sort of civic makeover of American society. We had it in the Glorious Revolution during the colonial era, a period of revolt and revolution in the late 17th century. About a decade later, we had the American Revolution. A lifetime later, we had the American Revolution. A lifetime later, the Civil War. A lifetime later, the Great Depression, New Deal, and World War II. And a lifetime later, here we are, right? The title of my book is The Fourth Turning is Here. Because since the GFC, we have been in this period, right? It's going to be a generation-long era. It won't end until the end of the 2020s, probably the beginning of the 2030s. And these eras have predictable similarities. And interestingly, halfway in between these crises, we have the great awakenings of American history. We're not rebuilding the outer world, we're rebuilding the inner world of religion and values and culture and art. And most recently, we had the 1960s and 70s, which was some historians call that America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening, right? So these are patterns, and they're related to a pattern. We sort of put these in a certain kind of order. We call them turnings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like seasons of the year, you start out with a first turning, sort of like the spring season. Most recently, we recall the American high, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy, a period when institutions were strong, individuals were weak, period of social conformity and a great sense of sort of collective progress, right?
So when you're breaking these down, like just so we can kind of get on the same page, like what is the first turning? What's the second turning? Like just broad strokes.
That's where I'm going with you.
Okay.
So that's the first turning. That's an example of the first turning.
Okay,
right?
got it.
It always comes after a crisis, right? So the crisis is over And everyone rallies around this newborn sense of community. Right?
Okay.
The second turning, the summer, is a period when individuals attack that social conformity. Everyone wants to throw off all that social obligation, all those rules. And in the 1960s, it started in universities. People wanted to throw off the patriarchy, the family. And then finally, it was in the economy. Everyone wanted deregulation and tax cuts. So all parties and ideologies sort of participated in this individuation of American society. And then the third turning, we call the unraveling, and that is the opposite of a high. That's the period that most recently, that would be the late 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. And that's a period when individualism is strong, institutions are weak. You go into a bookstore recently and every book is about, me, myself, and I, and how powerful I am. But all the downbeat books are about everything we share in common, right? The end of the family, the end of society. That's the mood of a third turning. Cynicism, bad manners, distrust of public institutions. And you see these are the decades like the roaring 1990s or the roaring 20s or the 1850s, 1760s. You can see these earlier decades. But history shows that every third turning eventually ends in a fourth turning. And a fourth turning is a period of crisis, and it's a period where we regain a sense of community by the time it's over, and a new sense of public trust. And I think that's where we're going. As tumultuous and as scary as this era is, and has been, both in the economy and in politics, we think that it has a really decisive ending, and it shifts history back. It shifts the saculum back to a place where America hasn't been for a long time. That is to say, in the summer season, no one wants order. Everyone wants the community to be less powerful and individualism to be stronger. By the end of this turning, people want community to be stronger and individualism to be weaker. And I think you can see that in the generation coming of age. Boomers were coming of age in the late 60s and 70s. They definitely wanted individuals stronger and institutions weaker. Millennials are coming of age in this fourth turning. And I think they want the opposite. I think they want institutions to be stronger, to protect people better. They're risk averse. They want the security that those institutions will bring, and they don't mind individualism being weaker. And I think one symptom of that is you see the millennials are strongly supportive of the party that happens to represent community today, which happens to be the Democratic Party. And that's simply a fact on the ground. Generation X is, on the other hand, is older. They're obviously in midlife right now, and they support much more supportive of the Republican Party. In fact, they're one of the most Republican-leaning generations we've seen, since the Lost, born in the 1890s. So we see some striking changes, and our method really is to follow generational cohorts through their lives and see how these generations, as they're shaped young, as children coming of age, as young adults, go on to shape history as they become parents and leaders.
How do you see the parallels here with what's going on in the economy during these periods of times? I'm just curious if you can. You've certainly talked about the some of these patterns, but do you have shadowing patterns in the economy?
I mean, the last two fourth turnings were actually precipitated by, or the catalyst was, a great global balance sheet crash and recession. It was Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, was quickly spread across the world. And most recently, it was the GFC, the global financial crisis of late 2008, which had a similar impact. And it also became global. It was also a very durable balance sheet recession. They both had the same decade over decade slowing impact on GDP per capita growth. And it's in the wake of this recession that a lot of millennials came of age and came of age with very pessimistic expectations about future standard of living growth. And I think one of the great hallmarks of our era is how younger people, not only millennials, but a lot of Xers, are no longer, by age 30 or age 40, earning more than their parents. In fact, boys are generally earning less than their fathers today, and a record share of them are living at home. Exactly what happened in the 1930s, by the way. We all remember those Frank Capra movies, like, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, with all of, many generations living in one big Victorian home, right? Well, that's happening again today. And I think, too, globally and geopolitically, we see the same trends. Globalization is in full retreat after 2008. Global trade as a share of global product reached its peak in 2007. It's generally been declining ever since. The same thing happened in 1929. We reached our peak. We were declining throughout, particularly after the Smoot-Hawley tariff and all of the trade policies of the 30s. That was also in decline. We saw authoritarian populism raging around the world in the 1930s. In fact, in the 30s, it was generally thought there were only two choices. You either became communist or fascist. There was no middle anymore. Capitalism failed. Liberal democracy failed. And I think in the same kind of mood today, you look around the world, right? You see authoritarian populism in South America. You see it in Southern Europe. You see it in India, the Philippines, China, Burma. I mean, you go around the world today, you see this as a rising trend. And we do cite polls, and many of them, showing that millennials today around the world have much less trust in democracy than older generations. Not only today, but if you go back and look at older generations, in their 20s and 30s, had much more trust than millennials today. So this is a moment of real political instability around the world. 10 years ago, no one even did polls on civil war in America. You know what I mean? No one even polled it. It just seems so outlandish. Today, you'll find about half of Americans think that's likely in the near future. We also see the threat of geopolitical conflict in a way we never had before. Now, these are, again, do I have to remind you the parallels to the 1930s, right? This idea of scaling up and the priority of community above individual was a strong theme of the 1930s. And it's becoming a strong theme today. And I think it's particularly, as always, embodied in the rising generation today. But we see this pattern again and again. This is not something new. This is, and I think we should recognize that there's a certain familiarity to this. We've seen it before, we see it again. And I will say that the generations who knew how to make big institutions work who, because they built them during crisis, are all dying out, right? And I think this is also a pattern we see again and again. Certain lessons need to be relearned, and certain skills simply disappear, and new habits have to be relearned.
How often does a fourth turning end up in war?
Historically, almost always. Not only war, I mean, there are wars all the time. I mean, there's almost every generation-long period in American history, there's been some war. But I think what's a lesson for history is that these tend to be very urgent wars. These tend to be total wars during fourth turnings. And, going all the way back for the last 6 or 7 centuries, all total wars have been in a fourth turning. Every fourth turning has had a total war, right? I mean, the examples I just gave you, I think you recall, is a war necessary for a fourth turning? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I will say this, that a sense of strong urgency and a sense of survival for the nation to motivate people to create a new community where before there has just been partisanship, division, and complete institutional dysfunction on the national level is a property of the climax of all fourth turnings, right? You wonder where America would be in the late 1930s when we were a completely divided nation over the New Deal if that had just been run and fast forward and that was never resolved, right? Or the Civil War if we had just been frozen in place, right? No, these things do resolve, and very often conflict is part of the resolution.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking is, again, trying to figure out where, when you look at where we are right now, what brings the nation together, a nation that, as you mentioned, people literally talking about civil war, what brings people together potentially for that first turning. It's like potentially an extrinsic type of enemy. And, is that a requirement? I guess I'm just trying to figure out, how do you get from where we are to what you're describing as a first turning?
It's very hard to predict. It will, my estimation is it will end one way or the other. But it's very hard to predict in advance. If you had asked Americans in 1936 or 37 that there was going to be a big crisis, what would it be? Would it be internal or external? I think they always said internal, right? We had Republicans thinking the 1930s was the red decade, and we had Popular Front supporters of FDR saying it was the fascist decade. You can understand how people would have predicted it back then, right? But interestingly, we ended up in a very different place. And I actually narrate the histories of these different fourth turnings and kind of go through the story of how knife edge the balance is, like which way we tip, right? When Abraham Lincoln was elected, his Secretary of State was William Seward, who was, also a very prominent Republican. And Seward's April 1st memorandum, just after Lincoln, swore into office, was that Lincoln should immediately declare war on Britain, France, and Spain to distract America from the so. Well, Lincoln turned down that proposal. Right. That's crazy. That isn't going to do the trick. We already have. It's Deep South has already seceded. But you understood what was going on in Seward's mind, right?
So, obviously as a historian, one of the reasons we study history is so that we can understand, lessons from the past, how to deal with crises. And so if you look at what we know and what you're studying, what you've studied in your career, what can history teach us about dealing with this crisis state that we're in right now and emerging from it?
Well, I think it can tell us a lot. First of all, it can just root us in part of it, get a sense of connectedness, both with our past and our future. I often tell people that they have a tremendous personal contact with others over time. Think about Buck, the oldest person you knew when you were a small child, right?
Right.
And think about the youngest person you will know before you pass away.
Right.
Think of their combined lifespans. I like to call that your personal history span, right?
Yeah.
I bet you it extends over 220, 230 years.
Uh-huh.
That's as long as the United States has been around. And I often tell people, we need to think about all they've been through, all your kids are going to be through. We're so often taught that history is nothing but a lot of random technological changes and accidents, that your children's world is going to be utterly different from yours, right? You have no connection to them, really. You have no connection to your parents. I try to root people in time better. And I also think that there's some lessons for us moving into the fourth turning. Some of them have to do with family life. Some of them have to do with politics and the economy. In family life, government is going to be busy, probably, in the climax of the fourth turning. It may be less generous for your benefits. You may not have the resources to protect you, to be the kind of safety net you're accustomed to. And I often tell people that families become much more important during fourth turning. So one lesson I have, particularly for younger people, and a lot of boomers too who got alienated from their family, is reconnect with your family. They will be very important to you. And I'm a financial advisor, right? So people are often asking me, what should my portfolio be? How should I invest? How should I diversify, right? How do I get alpha? All the usual questions. And the first question I say is, well, first of all, what's your long-term care insurance plan?
Right.
Now, as you know, there is no affordable long-term care insurance. Just forget it. There's nothing you can buy. There's only one long-term care insurance. That's family and friends. And if you're not connected with them going into this era, you need some repair work to do. That's one of my most important pieces of advice. I think when it comes to the economy, diversification has to be much broader than it usually is. We sometimes think about style factor diversification, but when you have a big crisis, all of the correlations go to one, right? Particularly across a single economy. So we have to think about diversification much more radically in terms of different kinds of assets, like commodities, even something like a hard asset that people usually don't own, like just having a little bit in gold or something like that. And genuine geographic diversification becomes much more important, in these kinds of events. I also think fixed income assets are nominally fixed income assets are probably not very good because these tend to be prone to surges of enormous inflation. In fact, inflation is one of the ways government pays off its debt. This always happens during every fourth turning, right? I mean, that's one way government gets out from under its debt, right? So if you're locked into a fixed income asset, you're rendering yourself vulnerable. You want something which is a real asset, which and hopefully one that is not too subject to onerous, regulation or even confiscation, at a time of crisis. So I also think commodities always come back in fourth turnings. They already are. In fact, we see a lot more attention to commodities today. In other words, materials and energy. If you want to look at that in S&P sector terms, manufacturing is even more important because fourth turnings are always eras when we rebuild the outer world. Remember, we're not going to be rebuilding the inner world. We're going to be rebuilding the outer world. And so manufacturing is important. Defense, obviously. And we've already seen a recovery in defense. I mean, countries around the world are already amping up, right? Not only due to the invasion in the Ukraine, but due to the prospect of hostilities in the Western Pacific. So these are trends that have already started. They will accentuate. I think private equity, so long as it's unleveraged, is a great bet. I say so long as it's unleveraged, because again, you get into that problem of, leveraging becomes very perilous at a time when God knows whether you can roll the loan over, right? So these are some tips. We don't have a lot of time, but you wanted to know a few things, and that would be my advice for the decade coming up.
Yeah. One thing about the decade coming up is, and I'm curious in your take on this. First of all, was what part of the cycle was the previous Great Depression? Would that have been?
That's the fourth turning. That's why I made all the parallels. Yeah,
right,
that's where.
Right. So one of the, I've talked to a few different economists concerned about, the demographic cliff that we're headed towards the end of this decade. With regard to, Medicare, Medicaid payments, and on top of that, all of these boomers being out of the workforce and drawing in on all the retirement funds, and the concern that would trigger ultimately, a Great Depression in the 2030s. That would not coincide with sort of a first turning, would it?
That demographic cliff is happening right now. So I don't know why they're talking about the 2030s. Some of the biggest cohorts in America were born from 1959 to 1964. They're all turning, early, the median age of retirement on Social Security is 64 right now. So, you do the math, we're right there. It's happening right now. And it was accelerated by the pandemic. So that's happening as we speak. And the new cohorts coming into the workforce are very small. And I'm not just speaking demographically here. Now, we've been very fortunate thus far, post-pandemic, to have a pretty superheated economy.
Sure.
Labor force participation among working, prime age Americans is pretty high. Unemployment rate is pretty low. So right now, things are pretty good, but the demographic fundamentals are terrible. And in fact, by 2026, 2027, this is just sort of OECD, UN demographic projections, the working age population in the entire high income world and emerging market world, I'm going to throw in China and India and Brazil there, is going to be shrinking. I mean, that's amazing. Basically the entire economically relevant world, its working age population will be shrinking. This is the first time since Adam Smith wrote, you know what I mean? This is the first time since the Industrial Revolution that we have had sort of the entire effective global economy shrinking in terms of its effective demographic workforce. So it's in this decade, Buck, that this is happening.
Yeah.
And we saw most dramatically what's been happening in China.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the one-child policy that was there for decades, and how that is going to, in your view, affect China's role in the future economy.
Well, I'm telling you, every demographer knew for a long time this was coming.
Sure.
China played denial, and then when it happened, it was covered up statistically. And then when they finally looked honestly at the statistics, they just saw this free fall. And right now, you have a very small cohort moving into the childbearing ages. So even with the same, what we demographers call total fertility rate, you're going to have an actual further shrinkage in the births. So the birth numbers in the 2020s in China are going to be disastrous. And, that plus their rapidly declining productivity growth, their total factor productivity, if you just look at how much they produce with a given quantity of labor and capital, it's falling as well. So I do think this has geopolitical repercussions, namely this power trajectory sense. When China was growing much faster than the rest of the world, there was no reason it should start a conflict. Just wait, time just makes us stronger and stronger, right? We don't have to, yes, we have the century of humiliation we have to overcome, right? But we don't have to do anything now. And the way we're going, the West is going to fall apart on its own. Now, I think the psychology is changing and actually becoming more dangerous. Now, I'm in Great Falls, Virginia. I'm outside D.C. I'm very close contact with a lot of national security people. And I guarantee you that that's not just my thinking. I think a lot of people are thinking that the mood in China is changing. China no longer believes that time is a wind at its back. Time may be a wind that it's a headwind, and it may need to act soon to actually change the mood of its people and to change the facts on the ground. I think this worries not just economists, but national security types here.
And what is the implications of that? What is the thought that China would do because of its concerns?
Face down the West. I think it's pretty clear. I think it's making common cause with fellow regimes, certainly with Russia. I think that was very clear in 2022. It now, it's likening the United States and Australia and New Zealand and Japan with the NATO of the West, and it's drawing all these parallels with Russia. They're making common cause. And with a number of other regimes as well, I think North Korea and Iran and many other sort of client nations. And I think what they want to do is at some point face down the West and show the West that it's not the way of the future. That their prestige is also on the line, right? They need to show that all of the countries they're investing in and so on, that they really are the wave of the future. That the West really is the still the imperialist power, and that it's in some sense illegitimate. And at some point, they need to demonstrate that with facts on the ground.
When you look at globally, different countries, which country, based on demographics and growth, are you most bullish on, let's say, in the next 10, 20 years?
I would say right now I'm very positive about China, just particularly from a demographic point of view, and partly just the geopolitical situation, would be Southeast Asian countries other than China, who are demographically not too bad. Some of them are still in sort of the Confucian orbit. I mean, all the Confucian culture countries have pretty negative demographic prospects right now, but a few of them aren't bad. Looking at Vietnam and Thailand, Philippines, very high fertility rate. It's going to be growing for a long time, and it's an Anglophone population, right? So they know how to speak English. They have they have some of the same benefits that India does. Now, India is slowing down. India is almost all the way down to replacement rate in terms of fertility. India is no longer the great grower that it used to be. But India also is still relatively a promising country, and obviously a very large country, and a country which is rapidly modernizing under Narendra Modi. So that area of the world, I think, is also pretty well run. I think Singapore is an alternative for Hong Kong. Obviously, people are already finding that out. It's hard to rent a hotel now in Singapore. And I hear Taylor Swift is coming soon to Singapore rather than Hong Kong. And so, it really is going to be hard to rent a hotel room. But my point is I'm pretty bullish on that area. I'm opportunistically bullish on Latin America. Brazil did something pretty good. They did one thing great under Bolsonaro, is they did solve some of their huge pension problem. One thing that was not noticed, they really did solve a lot of that enormous unsustainability of the Brazilian pension. There are epic stories in Brazil about you can retire at 55 and just lay out on the beach and collect your checks. That problem has been solved, and as long as they get through near term, sort of the political back and forth between left and right, potentially great future. So Latin America somewhere in the middle. I think Europe is facing huge growth headwinds. I mean, Southern Europe in particular. The Mediterranean countries in Europe are shrinking at an alarming rate. And I think many of these countries, I'm talking about Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and so on, these countries their workforce is shrinking so fast like that even in a normal year, their number of employees will shrink faster than their productivity improves. In other words, they will have negative GDP even in a normal year. So in other words, we might even call it an aging recession, sort of a permanently slightly negative GDP growth. And Eastern Europe is facing not only poor fertility, but also a lot of emigration, right, to Western Europe. Russia, I don't think we need to comment. That's, start the long list of headwinds for Russia. So
fascinating stuff, Neil. It's obviously a huge topic, and I appreciate your time today. How can people? Okay, so the book itself again is The Fourth Turning is Here. What the seasons of history tell us about how and when the crisis will end. That was released in July. I presume it's already on the Amazons and all that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how else can people get a hold of you and learn what you're doing and what you're thinking?
Well, we do have a subscription service, podcast, daily stuff going out, both written, podcast, video, and we actually have a feature that we're going to be starting this month called All About the Indicators, looking monthly at the indicators for the U.S. economy. And that will be starting on late August on Substack. So the name of the Substack publication is Demography Unplugged. So that's all you need to know. Demography Unplugged. You go there. It's not very expensive, and it's a great way for people to keep up both with what I say in the book, The Fourth Turning is Here, but also just if you're interested in demographics and the economy moving forward.
Phenomenal. Thanks again, Neil. Love to have you back again sometime in the future.
Great. Thank you, Buck. It was great.
I'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Fascinating stuff. I think this concept of repeating cycles of history and economics is very interesting, although it's kind of weird. I mean, why necessarily it would go specifically for a certain number of years and why you could predict it. And it's sort of beyond me. But I'm less of a social scientist and more of a scientist, so I think it's harder for me to understand that. But fascinating nonetheless. Anyway, that's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.